In the middle of the 20th century, Algeria was a land shared by two very different worlds. Along the coast were modern cities filled with European settlers who believed Algeria was part of France. But across the countryside lived millions of Algerians who had their own language, traditions, and a growing desire to rule their own land. For many years, these two realities existed side by side, uneasy and fragile. By the 1950s, that fragile balance would finally break, and Algeria would enter a long and bitter war for independence. The Algerian War was one of the most important and complex struggles for independence in the 20th century. The conflict lasted from 1954 to 1962 and was fought between Algerian nationalist movements and the government of France. Although the war itself lasted 8 years, the tensions that led to it had been building for more than a century. To understand why the war began, it is necessary to look back to the early days of French expansion into North Africa and the long history of colonial rule that followed. Algeria lies along the southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, only a short distance from Europe. Because of its location, the region had long been connected to trade routes, empires, and cultural exchanges between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. For many centuries before French conquest, much of Algeria had been part of the Ottoman Empire. Local rulers governed the region while maintaining ties to the wider Ottoman world. In 1830, however, the political balance of the region changed dramatically. France launched a military expedition against the city of Algiers. What began as a limited campaign soon turned into a full-scale invasion of the territory. Over the following decades, French forces gradually expanded their control across the region through a series of military campaigns. The conquest of Algeria was not quick or easy. Local resistance movements fought fiercely against the invading forces. One of the most famous leaders of this resistance was Emir Abdelkader, who organized a large coalition of tribes and communities to oppose French rule during the 1830s and 1840s. For many years, Abdelkader successfully resisted the French army and became a symbol of resistance and leadership. Eventually, however, the French military gained the upper hand. By the mid-19th century, France had established control over most of the territory. Algeria was gradually transformed into a colony that was closely integrated with the French state. Unlike many other colonies, Algeria was treated not simply as a distant possession, but as an extension of France itself. To strengthen their control, French authorities encouraged settlers from Europe to move into the region. Over time, hundreds of thousands of Europeans migrated to Algeria. Many came from France, but others arrived from Spain, Italy, and different parts of the Mediterranean. These settlers built farms, businesses, towns, and entire communities across the country. The European settlers eventually became known as the Pieds Noirs, a French phrase meaning black feet. They formed a powerful social and political group within Algeria. Many settlers prospered economically, owning farms and businesses that played an important role in the colony's economy. For the native population of Algeria, however, colonial rule often brought hardship and inequality. The majority of Algerians were Muslim Arabs or Berbers whose families had lived in the region for generations. Many lost land as colonial farms expanded across fertile areas. Traditional systems of agriculture and local governance were disrupted as the colonial administration imposed new rules and structures. The political system created by French authorities also treated the two populations differently. European settlers were granted full French citizenship and enjoyed significant political rights. They could vote, hold office, and influence the administration of the colony. In contrast, most Algerians were classified as subjects rather than citizens and had limited participation in political life. This system created a deep social divide. While settlers often lived in modern urban districts with better access to education, healthcare, and infrastructure, many Algerians remained in rural villages with fewer opportunities and resources. Despite these inequalities, organized political resistance developed slowly. In the early 20th century, Algerian intellectuals and reformers began forming political organizations that called for greater rights and reforms within the colonial system. Some hoped that Algeria could achieve equality while remaining connected to France. However, as time passed, many activists became increasingly frustrated with the lack of meaningful change. The colonial system remained firmly controlled by the French government and the European settler population. The Second World War marked an important turning point. During the war, many Algerians served in the French military and fought in campaigns across Europe and North Africa. Like soldiers from many other colonies, they hoped that their service would lead to political reforms once the war ended. Instead, the years immediately after the war brought tension and tragedy. In May 1945, demonstrations calling for independence and political reform took place in several Algerian cities. These protests were met with harsh repression by French authorities and settler militias. Violence spread through parts of the country, leading to thousands of deaths. The events of 1945 deeply shocked Algerian society. For many young nationalists, they confirmed the belief that peaceful reform within the colonial system was unlikely to succeed. Over the next decade, a new generation of activists began organizing more radical movements that openly called for independence. Among these emerging groups was the organization that would eventually become the National Liberation Front, commonly known as the FLN. The FLN believed that Algeria could only gain independence through armed struggle against colonial rule. Throughout the early 1950s, members of this movement worked secretly to build networks across the country. Small groups gathered weapons, trained fighters, and established connections in both rural villages and urban neighborhoods. Their goal was to launch a coordinated uprising that would challenge French authority and ignite a nationwide struggle for independence. Finally, on the night of November 1st, 1954, the FLN carried out a series of coordinated attacks across Algeria. Military posts, police stations, and government facilities were targeted in different regions of the country. Although the attacks were relatively small, they marked the beginning of a new and dangerous phase in Algeria's history. What began that night would soon grow into a long and bitter war that would transform both Algeria and France. After the attacks of November 1st, 1954, the situation in Algeria began to change rapidly. What had started as a series of small and scattered assaults soon developed into a growing conflict between the National Liberation Front, known as the FLN, and the French authorities who controlled the territory. At first, many French officials believed the uprising could be contained quickly. The attacks had been limited in scale, and the number of fighters involved seemed relatively small. French leaders assumed that with additional police and military forces, the rebellion could be suppressed before it spread further. However, the FLN had already begun building a much larger movement beneath the surface. Its leaders understood that defeating a powerful colonial army in direct battles would be extremely difficult. Instead, they adopted a strategy based on guerrilla warfare, political organization, and the gradual mobilization of the population. Guerrilla warfare relied on mobility, surprise, and knowledge of the landscape. Small groups of fighters could strike quickly against government targets and then disappear into mountains, forests, or villages before French forces could respond. Algeria's geography provided many opportunities for this type of warfare. Much of the country included rugged mountain ranges, remote valleys, and sparsely populated areas that were difficult for large armies to control. One of the most important regions for the FLN's early operations was the Ourez Mountains in eastern Algeria. This rugged area became a center of resistance where fighters could train, organize, and launch attacks against colonial authorities. From these mountainous regions, the insurgency slowly expanded into other parts of the country. At the same time, the FLN focused heavily on political organization. Its leaders believed that winning the support of the population was just as important as military success. Local networks were established in villages and towns to gather information, recruit new fighters, and collect supplies. Many ordinary Algerians found themselves caught between the two sides. Some supported the independence movement and helped the FLN in secret, providing food, shelter, or information. Others feared the consequences of involvement and tried to remain neutral. The war gradually reached into everyday life across the country. As the rebellion spread, France responded by increasing its military presence in Algeria. Thousands of additional troops were sent to the region in an attempt to restore order. French commanders launched operations aimed at locating and destroying FLN bases in the countryside. Despite these efforts, the conflict continued to grow. By the mid-1950s, the FLN had expanded its activities beyond rural guerrilla warfare. The organization began carrying out operations in major cities, especially in the capital city of Algiers. Algiers was a complex and divided city. European settlers lived in modern districts near the waterfront, while many Algerians lived in crowded neighborhoods known as the Kasbah. The narrow streets and densely built houses of the Kasbah made it difficult for security forces to control the area completely. The FLN used this environment to organize an urban campaign of bombings, assassinations, and sabotage. Small cells of fighters operated secretly within the city, targeting police stations, government offices, and locations associated with French authority. These attacks created a climate of fear and tension throughout Algiers. French authorities responded with increasingly strict security measures. Police patrols were expanded, checkpoints were established, and large military units were deployed to search neighborhoods suspected of harboring FLN members. The conflict in the city soon became one of the most famous episodes of the war, later known as the Battle of Algiers. French forces used extensive intelligence operations to track down FLN networks operating within the city. At the same time, the FLN attempted to maintain its campaign of urban resistance despite growing pressure from the security forces. As violence increased, the war began attracting attention beyond Algeria. International observers, journalists, and political leaders around the world started to follow events closely. Many newly independent countries in Asia and Africa expressed sympathy for Algeria's struggle for independence. Meanwhile, the conflict was becoming increasingly controversial within France itself. Some French citizens believed that Algeria must remain part of France at all costs, especially since many European settlers had lived there for generations. Others questioned whether continuing the war was worth the growing human and political cost. By the late 1950s, the Algerian War had become far more than a colonial conflict in a distant territory. It had grown into a major political crisis that affected the future of both Algeria and France. The fighting continued across mountains, villages, and cities, while the FLN strengthened its organization and France committed more soldiers to the struggle. What had begun as a small uprising was gradually transforming into a prolonged and deeply complicated war. By the late 1950s, the Algerian War had grown into one of the most difficult and controversial conflicts faced by France in the 20th century. What had begun as a relatively small rebellion only a few years earlier had now developed into a large and complex war that stretched across mountains, villages, deserts, and major cities. French authorities responded to the growing insurgency by dramatically increasing their military presence in Algeria. At the beginning of the conflict, only a limited number of soldiers had been stationed in the territory, but as the fighting expanded, France deployed more and more troops. Eventually, hundreds of thousands of French soldiers were sent to Algeria in an attempt to restore control and defeat the National Liberation Front. French commanders developed a strategy aimed at isolating the FLN from the population that supported it. They believed that if the guerrilla fighters could be separated from the rural villages that provided food, shelter, and information, the rebellion might gradually weaken. To achieve this goal, French forces carried out large military operations across the countryside. Villages suspected of helping the FLN were sometimes evacuated, and many civilians were relocated into guarded settlements where the army could monitor their activities. These measures were designed to prevent contact between villagers and guerrilla fighters hiding in nearby mountains or forests. At the same time, the French military improved its intelligence networks. Officers worked with informants and surveillance units to identify FLN members and disrupt their operations. In many cases, these intelligence campaigns were effective in locating guerrilla groups and capturing or killing their leaders. Despite these efforts, the conflict remained extremely difficult to control. Algeria was a vast country with diverse landscapes that included mountain ranges, deserts, and rural areas far from major cities. Even with large numbers of troops, it was impossible for French forces to maintain complete control over every region. The FLN continued adapting its strategy as the war progressed. Instead of concentrating large numbers of fighters in one place, they often divided their forces into smaller mobile units that could operate independently. These groups moved through remote areas, launching attacks when opportunities appeared and withdrawing before French troops could surround them. In addition to fighting inside Algeria, the FLN also established bases in neighboring countries, particularly Tunisia and Morocco. Both of these countries had recently gained independence from colonial rule and were sympathetic to the Algerian cause. From these safe havens across the borders, FLN fighters could train, organize, and prepare for operations inside Algeria. France responded by strengthening border defenses in an attempt to block the movement of fighters and supplies. Large barriers made of fences, barbed wire, and electronic sensors were constructed along sections of the Tunisian and Moroccan borders. These defensive systems were supported by patrols and observation posts designed to detect infiltration attempts. While these barriers reduced some cross-border movement, they could not completely stop the flow of fighters and resources supporting the FLN. The war therefore continued to spread across many regions of the country. Inside France itself, the Algerian War was becoming increasingly controversial. News of the conflict reached the French public through newspapers, radio broadcasts, and returning soldiers. Reports of harsh interrogation methods, torture, and civilian suffering sparked intense debates about the conduct of the war. Some French citizens believed that maintaining control of Algeria was essential. They argued that Algeria had been part of France for more than a century and that abandoning it would weaken the nation's global influence. Many European settlers living in Algeria also strongly supported continued French rule, fearing what independence might mean for their future. Others, however, began questioning whether the war could truly be won or whether it should continue at all. Intellectuals, political leaders, and activists increasingly criticized the human cost of the conflict. Demonstrations and political debates about the war became more frequent. At the same time, international attention to the Algerian conflict continued growing. Newly independent countries across Asia and Africa expressed support for Algeria's independence movement. The United Nations also began discussing the situation as part of the broader global movement against colonial rule. For the FLN, gaining international recognition became an important part of their strategy. Their leaders understood that political pressure from other countries could eventually influence France's decisions about the future of Algeria. By 1958, the situation had reached a critical point. The war had dragged on for several years with no clear resolution in sight. French forces controlled most major cities and transportation routes, but the FLN remained active across large parts of the countryside. The conflict had become both a military struggle in Algeria and a political crisis within France itself. Events during this period would soon lead to dramatic changes in French politics and open the door to negotiations that might finally end the war. By the late 1950s, the Algerian War had reached a turning point. After several years of intense fighting, it had become clear that the conflict could not be resolved quickly through military means alone. French forces had achieved a number of tactical successes on the battlefield. Large areas of the countryside had been brought under tighter military control, and several important FLN networks had been disrupted. Yet despite these efforts, the independence movement remained active and determined. At the same time, the war was creating a growing political crisis within France itself. The conflict was expensive, controversial, and deeply divisive. French society was increasingly divided over the question of Algeria's future. Some believed that Algeria must remain part of France under any circumstances. Others believed that continuing the war would only prolong suffering and instability. In 1958, this tension reached a dramatic moment. In Algeria, many European settlers and some military officers feared that the French government in Paris might eventually abandon the colony. Demonstrations and political unrest erupted in the city of Algiers, where groups demanded stronger leadership that would guarantee Algeria remained under French rule. The crisis soon spread into French politics. Amid the uncertainty and growing instability, many leaders turned to a figure who had once guided France through another difficult period of history. His name was Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle had been a prominent leader during the Second World War and was widely respected for his role in leading the French resistance against German occupation. In 1958, he returned to power as the leader of a new government. Many people hoped he could bring stability and find a solution to the increasingly complex Algerian conflict. At first, de Gaulle's position on Algeria was not entirely clear. Some supporters believed he would preserve French control over the territory. Others suspected he might eventually support a path toward independence. Over time, it became evident that de Gaulle believed the war could not continue indefinitely and that a political settlement would eventually be necessary. While political discussions were developing, the fighting in Algeria continued. French forces maintained large military operations across the country, while the FLN continued its campaign of guerrilla warfare and political mobilization. Both sides understood that the outcome of the war might ultimately depend as much on political negotiations as on military victories. Gradually, international pressure also increased. Across the world, colonial empires were beginning to dissolve as many countries in Africa and Asia gained independence. The Algerian struggle was increasingly seen as part of this broader historical movement. In the early 1960s, secret negotiations began between representatives of the French government and the FLN. These discussions were complex and often tense. Years of conflict had created deep mistrust between the two sides, and finding common ground required careful diplomacy. Despite these difficulties, progress was slowly made. Both sides understood that the war had already caused enormous suffering and that a negotiated peace might be the only realistic way forward. Finally, in March 1962, an agreement was reached in the town of Evian in France. The agreement, often known as the Evian Accords, established a ceasefire between French forces and the FLN. It also laid out the process that would lead to Algeria's independence. Soon afterward, a national referendum was held in Algeria to determine the future of the country. The results showed overwhelming support for independence. On July 5, 1962, Algeria officially became an independent nation, ending more than 130 years of French colonial rule. The end of the war, however, was accompanied by significant upheaval. Many European settlers who had lived in Algeria for generations felt uncertain about their future in the newly independent country. In the months surrounding independence, hundreds of thousands of Pieds Noirs left Algeria and moved to France. For Algeria, independence marked the beginning of a new chapter in its history. The country faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding after years of war. Infrastructure had been damaged, communities had been disrupted, and political institutions needed to be developed for the new nation. At the same time, the war left deep emotional and historical scars. Hundreds of thousands of people had died during the conflict, including soldiers and civilians from both sides. Families had been separated, villages destroyed, and lives permanently changed by years of violence and uncertainty. In France, the Algerian War also left a lasting impact. It forced the country to confront the realities of colonial rule and the changing political landscape of the 20th century. The war reshaped French politics and contributed to the transformation of France's global role after the era of empire. Today, historians often view the Algerian War as one of the most significant struggles of the post-war period. It was a conflict that combined military warfare, political negotiation, and powerful movements for national independence. The war not only determined the future of Algeria, but also symbolized the broader global transition from colonial empires to independent nations. For the people of Algeria, The long struggle for independence became a defining moment in the nation's identity. The memory of those years continues to shape the country's history, culture, and collective memory. The Algerian War, lasting nearly 8 years, was therefore far more than a regional conflict. It was a chapter in the global story of decolonization, a period when many societies around the world sought to determine their own future and independence. And although the guns finally fell silent in 1962, the echoes of that long struggle remain part of the historical landscape of both Algeria and France.